Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've been reading and authors that I've been interviewing. And today I am joined by the author Anne Morrissy, who is here to talk about her book, Street Fight. Now, Street Fight looks like it's about prohibition and gangsters. It's not. It takes place in Chicago, but it's about taxi wars. That's right, taxi wars between Yellow Cab, Checker Cab, the Hotel LaSalle. I never heard a lot of these things back in 1919 through 1930. She is a wonderful writer who gives us this historical view of this tumultuous period of time and the rise of the Yellow Cab, the rise of the rival Checker Cab, the Civil War that went on inside of Checker Cab for control of the company. She talks a lot about it, including her great great grandfather, who was the president of Yellow Cab and who died under mysterious circumstances one Christmas Day, I think back in 1927. You don't want to miss that. It's a wonderful book. It's a great interview. Let's go right to that right now with Anne Morrissy. Anne, welcome to Books and Looks.
Hi, Blaine. Thanks for having me. This is really fun.
I am glad we could finally get together. If my readers and followers remember, you had pneumonia, pretty serious pneumonia, as a matter of fact.
I did. That was unfortunate, but I appreciate your willingness to reschedule, and you did a great preview episode about the book, and I appreciate that as well.
It was so good. I didn't want to skip anything. I want people to hear about it and go out and rush out and buy it. So let's do the same thing now. We're going to get into more detail, friends. We're going to do a lot more than I could give you. She's the author. She knows the whole story. I'll tell you what. So anyway, let's talk about you. Before we get into the book, let's talk about who is Anne Morrissey? Where are you from? Where you go to college? Do you take any creative writing classes? Things like that.
Yeah, so I'm originally from the Lake Geneva area of Wisconsin, which is about 2 hours north of Chicago. It's a resort area for the greater Chicago area. And I went to Kenyon College, which is a writing focused liberal arts college in central Ohio. So I took quite a few creative writing courses there. I also had the opportunity at Kenyon to do a short internship at the National Geographic magazine. So I had some really great mentors and really great opportunities while I was there. I majored in creative writing at Kenyon, and that kind of put me on the path that I'm on today. So it was a good training for what I do now.
Wow. Well, let's talk. What are you doing? You had writing is not your writing books is not your main profession. What? Tell everybody about what you do.
Yeah, so nowadays I am the editor of a luxury lifestyle magazine based in the Lake Geneva area. It's called At the Lake Magazine. And I sort of compare it to, if people have heard of the Hamptons magazine for the New York area, I compare At the Lake to sort of the Hamptons magazine, but for the Chicago area. So we cover all kinds of lifestyle, historic topics. We do luxury home tours, things like that. It's a quarterly publication, so it keeps me busy, but it also allowed me just enough time to write a book in between all of those duties.
Wow. Now, as editor, do you also write any other than maybe an opening column? Do you write anything else for the magazine?
I do. Yeah. I actually started out before I was the editor, I was a freelance writer for them for 13 years. And my specialty was kind of the history articles that we do for At the Lake. So I have written probably close to 100 articles about historic houses, historic residents of the Lake Geneva area, interesting, sort of military history. We had a United States Air Force base nearby, so I wrote about that. I mean, basically anything that I think people would find interesting historically, I will write about.
Okay. Now, Lake Geneva, are we near the Wisconsin Dells area?
So the Dells is about an hour and a half north of us. We are, if you draw a line between Madison and Milwaukee, and then you make a triangle, we're kind of the bottom point of that triangle. So very close to the Illinois border is where we are
Okay.
located.
Had some wonderful walleye pike at
Yes.
when I was up at the Dells. They have that in the Lake Geneva
Yeah,
area? They do? Yeah. Okay.
we sure
Good.
do. Yeah, actually,
Good.
one of my great grandfather's nicknames was Pike because
Look at that.
he loved to swim and he loved to fish.
Great, great, wonderful. Well,
Yep.
that's great. Well, very good. Now, when did you? This is not your first book. When did you start writing your first book, and what was that?
Yeah. So prior to this book, I did a smaller publication. It was a regional publication about the history of a sort of groundbreaking water safety organization in the Lake Geneva area. That book is called Running the Reds: The Water Safety Patrol's First 100 Years, 1920 to 2020. And it was very helpful to do that project first because it was sort of a similar research process in that I was doing a lot of research about the 1920s and about transportation and safety in the 1920s for that book. And that is sort of was good training ground for the Taxi Wars book as well. So that book came out in 2019, and that was kind of the jumping off point for Taxi Wars.
Okay. Wow. Well, I'm going to tell you what, that was some research book. I'm going to tell you what, a lot of research friends when you go into this book. Anne's book is called Street Fight. Now, I saw this. Okay, I got the book here. Hold on, everybody. I got the book here. Okay, Street Fight. And you see that? You see that? You see that? Yeah, that window is shot out. I get this book. I said, we're talking Al Capone. We're talking the gangsters and prohibition. Wow, I can't wait to get it. And then I opened it up. I said, holy moly, this is not about Al Capone. Tell us, what is Street Fight all about?
So, Street Fight is the story of kind of the rise of the cab industry in Chicago, which started in the 1910s when automobiles started becoming more prevalent on the streets. Chicago was kind of the epicenter of the cab industry at that time, partly because of Yellow Cab. Chicago's Yellow Cab was one of the first sort of major cab companies that was scaled up to a very large scale, ambitious business model. And because of that, and because of their success, they then also inspired a lot of rivals to try and sort of steal some of that business away from Yellow Cab. So initially, the taxi wars were sort of Yellow Cab drivers were sort of the Goliath in the midst, and then there were these smaller operators who were trying to sort of steal what they could business wise from Yellow Cab. That's how it started. One of the rival companies that sprang up was Checker Taxi, and Checker Taxi starts around 1920, 1921. And then by 1922, they are a major player in the taxi wars for a variety of reasons. The Checker Taxi Company, starting in 1922, also starts to go through a very intense civil war where two different factions are trying to gain control of the Checker Taxi operation. And that actually led to some of the deadliest violence in the taxi wars was the internal civil war at Checker Taxi. So this goes on for, over 10 years that this is happening on the streets of Chicago. And this is a time period where you could be riding in the back of your taxi cab on your way to dinner, and another taxi would pull up alongside yours, and that driver would start shooting at your driver while you're in the back of the cab.
Imagine that. Imagine that. Oh my God. Well, now,
Yeah.
you gave us a lot of information in a short period of time. We're going to have to break this down because I'll tell you what, this is something else. This is really something. Let's begin with some of the 4 or 5 leading figures in this taxi war. Give us some names we may have heard, may not have heard, should have heard of. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. So, Yellow Cab, as I said, was the first major cab company in the city, and that was co-founded by a man named Walden Shaw and his business partner, John D. Hertz. And John Hertz is somebody that most people have heard of because John Hertz eventually went on to found Hertz Rent-A-Car, which is still a popular rental car company. John Hertz was a very visionary business leader of this era, and he was really the big mover and shaker in many ways behind what Yellow Cab was doing and expanding to do at the time. So that's on the Yellow Cab side. They're one of the rival cab companies early on in the days of the taxi wars was the Hotel LaSalle in Chicago, which was one of the big opulent hotels. They had their own in-house taxi company for a while. And so one of the players in the book is the general manager of the Hotel LaSalle, a man named Ernest J. Stevens. Most people probably haven't heard of Ernest J. Stevens, but they have heard of his son, John Paul Stevens, who became a justice of the Supreme Court later in life. So that was an interesting sort of tie-in to the story. And then over at Checker Taxi, you've got two kind of powerful people who are vying for control of Checker Taxi for most of the 1920s, and their names were Morris Markin Morris Markin was the owner of the Checker Cab Manufacturing Company, which made the cabs for Checker Taxi, and he's trying to take over Checker Taxi so he can control one of his major clients. And the other person at Checker Taxi was a man named Bob McLaughlin. And Bob McLaughlin was a very I don't want to call him a shady character, but he was very connected to the North Side Gang run by Bugs Moran. And his brother, Eugene Red McLaughlin, was one of the most sort of feared independent gangsters in the city at the time.
By the way, I love all the old nicknames, don't you? Yeah. We have Bugs, we got Red, we got all these. You don't have nicknames like that anymore, you know?
It's great.
You have omitted one person that I know he might not be because of the
Hmm.
top man, but you've omitted one person. That's a person you're related to. Tell us a little bit about that gentleman. Tell us what his position was. Just tell us initially who was that and what was his position.
Yeah, yeah. So people often ask me how I got interested in this topic, and I tell them that it is because my great grandfather, a man named Charles Wellington Charlie Gray, he actually was the president of the Yellow Cab Company in the 1920s. And he started out actually as a cab driver, but he also was very good friends with John Hertz going back to their earliest days together. And so, because of that connection, he very rapidly worked his way up from a cab driver to a garage supervisor. And then he was John Hertz's right hand man for many years. And then eventually John Hertz decides he wants to step away from the day-to-day operations, and he puts my great-grandfather Charlie Gray in charge of Yellow Cab. Charlie Gray is president of Yellow Cab for just 2 years in the 1920s before he dies under kind of mysterious circumstances at the height of the taxi
We'll
wars.
get to that. We'll
So that
get to
was the
that. Yeah.
interest, the point of
Yeah.
interest that started the whole
Right.
topic for me.
But then it wasn't just that. Now did you have family archives on him?
It's funny, when I started the project, I actually did not. I started the project because I was trying to find out more about these taxi wars that I had heard about my whole life, and I had not heard much about them. There were no other books I could find about it. Unfortunately, because of my grandparents were divorced in the 1960s, long before I came into the world, and because of that, I actually never met that line of the family. So I did not at the time have any archives. While I was working on the book, my mom's sister was able to track down a really important scrapbook of newsletters, employee newsletters from the Yellow Cab Company for about 2 or 3 years in the 1920s. So I did eventually find a really incredible treasure trove of information through the family, but not initially. I didn't have that at first.
Wow. But now then you go to a party or a function and you start talking about what you're thinking of writing and somebody says, "Oh, I know something." Well, tell us that story because that's another interesting.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. I was at a book release party for my previous book, the one about the Water Safety Organization. And the a woman who hosted the party, she hosted it at her historic home, this beautiful historic home. And so after the party, I was thanking her for hosting the party, and her adult son was standing with us as well. And he said, "Oh, so what's your next book going to be about?" And I said, "Well, I'm kind of thinking I'd like to write a book about the taxi wars in Chicago in the 1920s." And previously, when I had told anybody this topic, most people had never heard. They were just like, "I don't know what that is. I've never heard of that." When I told him this, his name was Steve. When I told Steve this, Steve's whole face lit up and he said, "Oh my gosh." He said, "My great grandfather founded the Yellow Cab Company in Chicago." And I realized in that moment that I was standing in the room with the granddaughter and great grandson of Walden Shaw, who had been John Hertz's business partner and who had founded the Yellow Cab Company in 1915. So they also were able to give me a really great art family archive that they had done quite a bit of research into Walden Shaw's business operations and businesses that had led up to Yellow Cab, and all sorts of really interesting things that way as well.
Right. Well, if I'm not mistaken, didn't he and Mr. Hertz actually have like a hauling company first where they would haul materials around?
So actually, John Hertz did have a job driving a delivery truck before he did any of this. The first business that he partnered with Walden Shaw on was a car sales operation. So Walden Shaw was actually the dealer for a specific type of French car in Chicago called a Berlier. I believe that's how it's pronounced, but car fanatics might correct me on that. Um, and they initially started this car dealership, and John Hertz, being the kind of visionary businessman he was, he realized that if you were going to sell a new car to a client, you had to accept their old car in trade in order to convince them to buy a new car. And so they started taking in used cars in trade, and they didn't know what to do with them. And so John Hurt said, "Well, what can we do with a bunch of used cars?" And he had remembered being a delivery driver. And he said, "Well, I know that there's money in delivery." He said, "What could we deliver?" And he kind of came up with this idea of an automobile livery for people. And so they turned their used vehicles that they took in on trade, they turned them into the Shaw Livery Company, which was the predecessor to the Yellow Cab Company.
Yeah, I knew there was a livery in there somewhere. I couldn't quite remember after these many months, but I remember that. Wow.
Yeah.
Yellow Cab was revolutionary because back then, if people wanted to go from point A to point B, they either walked or took a horse, if I'm not mistaken.
Chicago had some options. Luckily, we had one of the largest cable car systems in the country at this time, larger actually than San Francisco's. And so you had cable cars, you had these horse-drawn buses that they called omnibuses. They were not the ideal way to get around. They were very slow, they were very uncomfortable, they were overcrowded. But we did have, those transportation options, and then of course the electric, the L had opened some of its lines by that point, so you could take the train around town. But people prior to this, if they wanted like a private ride, they would ride around in these horse-drawn hansom cabs. And the horse-drawn hansom cabs were basically just two-seater carriages behind a horse, and you would hail it on the street. And the hansom cabs were sort of known for being a little bit. They would sort of quote you a price based on how rich you looked, right? And so you could sort of feel like you were getting ripped off by taking the hansom cabs sometimes. So it was not an ideal system, certainly.
Plus, it was cold or rainy or snowy. You're out there in the inclements there.
Correct. Yes, and the roads were mud, so I mean it was not great.
No. Now, when they started Yellow Cab, and I like to just very quickly document their, I thought, astounding growth. How many cabs did they begin with, and how soon had they expanded to a huge number of cabs?
Yeah, so they start the company with 45 cabs on the street in August of 1915. By the early 1920s, they have something like 3,000 drivers working for them, driving like 1,500 cabs, basically. I mean, it was an astonishing growth rate. And the thing that they would have done it faster, but the thing that slowed them down was they actually early on decided that they needed to build their own purpose-built cabs because the cars that were available at the time were not really well suited to being a cab. They were very heavy. They were very not fuel efficient at all. And so, if you're trying to, sort of make your margins as close as you can to make the most money, they decided to make their own cabs. And so they could only make something like 2 cabs a day in their manufacturing plant. And that was really the only thing stopping them from scaling up this business model to 1,500 cabs even sooner than that.
Well, now, did they make cabs? Because this is a separate business than the actual driving cab company. Did they make it for other companies, or was it just for their own Yellow Cab?
No, they did. They made, cabs for companies all over the country. Initially, because there were other cab companies around the country buying their yellow cabs, they did start to try to franchise the Yellow Cab Company to other cities. So at one point, other cities around the country had a sort of an outpost of the Yellow Cab Company of Chicago. They very quickly realized that that was not that was maybe one too many businesses. And so instead, they just started selling their cabs to any cab company that wanted it and not franchising the whole concept. So there were yellow cabs all over the country. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now, one of the things that interesting me is very quickly with 45 cabs, they start to dominate. And I mean, dominate this business. And they make arrangements with what, men's clubs and restaurants about their cab. Tell us a little bit about those arrangements.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so those arrangements actually were an extension of the arrangements they had had with their previous company, Shaw Livery. Shaw Livery, those were technically not taxi cabs because they did not have meters in them. The taxi meter had not been invented yet, or was not widespread yet. So the Shaw cabs, the way they worked is they had these deals with upscale clubs and fancy hotels and theaters in the city, and if you were a member or a guest at any of these places, you could sign up for an account with Shaw Livery, and then the hotel would get the car for you and charge it directly to your bill or your club bill or whatever it might be. So when Yellow Cab comes into being in 1915, they kind of continue this arrangement with several of the upscale clubs and hotels, but instead of providing a Shaw Livery vehicle, they start providing yellow cabs to them. And in exchange for this, the hotels and the clubs, they realize that they have a lucrative thing going. They have the wealthy clients that Yellow Cab wants. So the hotels and the clubs start asking for more and more money from Yellow Cab in exchange for access to these clients. And so this was kind of one of the first points of friction in the taxi wars. Is eventually Yellow Cab says, you know what, we don't think we're going to do that anymore. We're not going to pay you these fees that you're requiring of us. We're just going to open a cab stand across the street from your hotel where your guests can just walk out the door and come get a cab from us, if they want to. And so this was one of the first friction points in the taxi wars.
And then that, my understanding is that's what led to the first competitor, which was the Hotel LaSalle, starting their own taxi business.
Correct. Yes, they were the first big competitor.
Were they lucrative?
Initially, I think it was. One of the things I was able to track down was the entire, ledgers and operating reports from the Hotel LaSalle taxi department had been donated to the Chicago History Museum and were just sitting in a box in the basement of the Chicago History Museum. I don't think anybody had looked at them for 100 years. So I was able to find the original ledgers that they had, and the first year, of course, when you start any business, you're sort of operating, in the red for the first year because you have a huge outlay of funds to get enough cars and hire the drivers. But by the second year, they were breaking even. By the third year, they were making money. They were making money for a couple of years there, but by the time Checker Taxi comes on the street and Yellow Cab has by that point scaled up to their 1,500 cabs on the street, by that point, the Hotel LaSalle was kind of no longer competitive. So it was a short period of time, but they were making money on it for a while.
Now, friends, before we go any further, we've heard about personal family archives, friends' families' archives, and now we've heard about cartons of paper in the basement of a history museum. We'll talk about the research that went into this, and you did some amazing, amazing research. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it was a big undertaking. As I said, there were no books. There was really nothing already written on this topic. So the first place I started searching actually were online newspaper archives because I started the project during the pandemic. A lot of the places I would have liked to go to research in person, I couldn't actually go and do that. But the online archives of the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Daily News and some of the Chicago newspapers of the era were available, from anywhere. So I started researching, just doing a lot of newspaper research. And ultimately, I collected over 1,000 newspaper clippings, both from online research and in person research on microfilm at the library and things like that. So that actually helped me put all of these events together in order. And then from there, I would just start digging for any additional documentation I could find. So that's how I ended up at the Chicago History Museum in the basement. That's how I did end up finding some self-published books by children of taxi drivers of the era that I was able to go to special collections and look at those. So it was just I didn't never gave up, and I found a lot of stuff that way.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. That's wonderful. I like the fact that the self-published books, they were still doing it back then. It's not a new phenomenon.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Well, now, when does Checker Cab come on the scene, and what was the impetus behind them wanting to horn in on the yellow cab business?
Yeah, so even early on, there was quite a bit of contention between Yellow Cab, which was a very corporate structure. It was a very top down corporate structure. So The company owns every single cab in its fleet. Every employee is actually made an owner operator because they pioneer the use of stock options at Yellow Cab, which is kind of a new concept back then. So they make everybody a part owner of the company. They give them dividends. They take really good care of their employees. However, because of that, those employees are kind of prohibited from joining a union. So they are a non-union shop at Yellow Cab because of some of these employee perks and pioneering things that they're doing. And that creates a lot of friction with some of the independent and smaller company cab drivers on the streets who feel that they are sort of wielding their size and their power to steal fares away from the smaller cab companies. So, starting in 1919, some of those independent cab drivers get together and they say, well, why don't we form an affiliation? We'll still be independent drivers, but let's form an affiliation and let's call it Checker Taxi. So that starts in 1919, and they also scale this concept up very quickly to where by I think 2021 or 1921 or 1922, they have like 600 Checker Taxi affiliated cabs on the streets. So that is sort of their response to how to respond to this giant company in their midst, which is Yellow Cab.
Wow. I gotta be honest with you. As I'm reading this book, I'm thinking of Star Wars, and I'm seeing the evil empire. And the evil empire is Checker Cab. I mean, they would do anything to get it, it seemed like to me. I mean, am I wrong? But really, Yellow Cab tried to play within the rules, not Checker.
So that was kind of my big takeaway as well. However, I do think that part of what Checker's challenge is because they're sort of a leaderless company, right? They're an affiliation of independent drivers, and the way that they come up with their president and their vice president every year is they have these shareholder elections. And because every cab driver in the company owns his own cab and is an affiliate member of this group, every cab driver gets one vote. So it seems like a democratic approach, right? But it actually leads to some really sort of strong arming, I would say, where once these two factions realize that all they have to do is convince enough people who are driving for Checker to vote for them, and then they can have control of the company. Then they start some very underhanded methods to get enough votes to be put in charge of Checker Taxi. And this is all just part of the fact that this company did not have a top-down structure. It had a more lateral structure in terms of who was going to be elected to be in charge of it. So they do come off as the evil empire, and I will tell you, I think that my great grandfather would absolutely have agreed with that assessment because at Yellow Cab, I think they really resented what was happening over at Checker.
They were always going to court. They're always suing Yellow Cab for this. Let's go. Let's bitch about this to the mayor and to the city council. Boom, ba, boom, ba, boom. And
Yeah,
so I
yeah.
just didn't, didn't. By the way, we mentioned one thing back a minute ago about Yellow Cab. Friends, you don't realize how progressive they were. They didn't they provide lawyers for their employees and doctors? Tell us just a little bit about the perks that they got at Yellow Cab.
Yeah, no, so this is some of what I learned from the employee newsletters that they put out every week or every other week. If you worked for Yellow Cab in any capacity, which means, and they had a huge workforce, not just drivers, but people they had instructors to teach the new drivers how to drive. They had car washers, they had, mechanics, they had everybody. If you are, an employee of Yellow Cab and you are there for enough months, you are made a part owner of the company through stock options. But then you also have access to, they had an in-house doctor, they had an in-house dentist, they had an in-house tailor, they had an in-house attorney, and you have access to all of this free of charge, essentially. They would even they had a delivery a nurse that would stop by your house if your wife was having a baby. They would send the nurse to your house to help deliver your baby. I mean, they took amazingly good care of their employees.
Yeah, I read that. I couldn't believe it. That was amazing what they were doing back then. Wow. Well, now we got we tempted everybody with that picture of the shot out, blown out window. Let's talk about some of the violence. And friends, it's not just Checker on Yellow. As Ann said, it was a civil war within within Checker Cab. Tell us about some stories about some of the violence you had going on there.
Yeah, yeah. So it starts out because they're trying to convince these independent cab drivers to vote for their preferred candidate at the shareholders elections. And they do that first by going and sort of physically intimidating them. So there's a lot of people getting beaten up during this period. There's people getting shot because they refuse to vote for the person that the assailant wants them to vote for. It starts out like that. Eventually, it escalates to, I mean, one of the scenes in the book that has most stuck with me is, shortly after the mob-affiliated, sort of union guys get, into the race for the control of Checker Taxi, the first time they're actually defeated. And so they, because they are not in charge, they come back after the new president is installed. They come back to the Checker Taxi garage in broad daylight at like 2 o'clock on a Saturday and just start open shooting every, they're shooting at the garage doors, they're shooting at the offices, they're looking for the new president, trying to murder him in broad daylight. Unfortunately for them, he is not on the premises that day. So instead they shoot a couple of security guards and call it a day. But I mean, it was just this brazen daylight attack where they were going to come in and, they didn't like the outcome of the election. So they were going to come and shoot everybody that got elected, essentially. And it was, I mean, it was shocking to learn that this had happened and we'd sort of forgotten about it.
Oh, I mean, there were bombings, there was arson, there was fist fights, you name
Yeah.
it, there was everything going on.
Yeah, yeah, they would plant bombs under cabs, they would plant bombs in restaurants where they knew that the taxi drivers would hang out, if they thought they were having a meeting to, organize against them, they would, like, plant a bomb somewhere. There was one situation where, once the kind of gangster-affiliated union guys do get into power, they get wind of the fact that the other faction is, planning a meeting essentially to oust them, and they find out that it's at the Great Northern Hotel. So the gangster guys show up at the Great Northern Hotel with sawed-off shotguns in their coats and are waiting outside the hotel to shoot these guys when they come out of the hotel. Luckily, somebody tipped off the guys who were having the meeting. They call the police, and the police come and arrest the guys with the sawed-off shotguns. So in that situation, it worked in their favor. But, I mean, it was a wild time, really.
Yeah, yeah. Now let me ask this question. I don't know. I remember there's something called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Was that part of this at all?
So it was not. It was a little bit after the resolution of a lot of what was going on at Checker Taxi. Or I would say, that it was sort of a quieter time at Checker Taxi by the time the St. Valentine's Day Massacre happens. However, I did come across an interesting tidbit, which is that one of the men who was killed in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre had been a former Yellow Cab garage superintendent, and he had left Yellow Cab because he got in with the North Side gangs and had been sort of promoted and was sort of a right-hand man to one of the top North Side gang, agents, basically. So he was at the garage that day, and he was one of the men who was murdered. So that, no, you don't have to dig far to find a little bit of a Taxi Wars connection to something.
You're right. My word, my word. Now, let's talk a little bit about your great grandfather and his demise. Because, friends, when you get to this, when she tells you the story, when you read this, you don't believe it. It's a Christmas day. What year was that?
It's 1927, Christmas Day. He had at the time he had 6 children under the age of 12 at home. So my understanding is they got up, they opened Christmas presents around the tree, and then he told his wife he was going for a ride, a horseback ride. He kept a horse at a country club close to their home, and he did like to ride most days if he could for exercise. So he got up and he went, and he ended up meeting up with his brother-in-law and one of the officers of the Yellow Cab Company, and they all got their horses hitched up and they decided to go out for a ride in Jackson Park. I already feel like the timing of this seems suspicious to me, right? You've got 6 kids at home and you're like, "Hang on, I'm gonna go meet with one of my colleagues for a quick Christmas morning horse ride," right? So they're out riding, and, you never really get a straight story from the other 2 that were with him that day. Depending on who's interviewing them, they tell a different story, but Neither one of them, they claim they did not see what happened. They said, "Oh, I never saw anything. I don't know what happened. We just came around a bend and we found him on the ground next to his horse." And it turned out he had a single skull fracture is what killed him. So, it's possible. It's entirely possible that he fell off the horse. There are, many incidents in history of horsing accidents, and that is entirely possible that that happened. However, all of the timing of it, when you read some of the other things that are going on during the taxi wars at this time, and you slot it into the other things that are happening, a year before this and a year after this, it does seem like suspicious timing and kind of a suspicious accident to me. But unfortunately, it's been 100 years. I don't think we'll ever know the answer to really what happened to him that day on the horse. But yes, unfortunately, he did die because of that sad
So
accident
he was dead
slash
when they found
incident.
him. He was already dead.
He they did rush him to a hospital. They flagged down a passing city bus, which I was surprised by. That was the fastest way to get him to the hospital. So the people on the bus came out and helped carry him onto the bus and to the hospital. He was from what I understand, he was essentially pronounced dead at the hospital. So yeah, it was a sad
Yeah.
story that
They
day.
didn't call a cab, did they? No, they took a bus.
No, no, they did not.
Well, it's probably faster than trying to get him there on a horse. So, it might be.
Yeah.
You have no idea. That's just a fascinating incident that happened, and no one will know the answer to that. And like I said, it was Christmas Day. And things were pretty calm between Checker and Yellow at the time, weren't they?
They were sort of there was a truce that had sort of been figured out between the 2 companies at that time. However, I will say, the shareholder elections for Checker Taxi were always held in the beginning of January, and a lot of the major incidents that you see surrounding the Checker Taxi, Civil War happen in late December and early January, so that's another reason the timing is a little suspicious to me.
I see.
But again, I don't know that we'll ever know,
No,
unfortunately.
no. Are they going to make a movie out of this? What do you think? Has anybody contacted you about a mini series or a movie?
Every single person I tell the story to, one of the first things they say is, "Oh my gosh, it sounds like a movie. It would make a great series." It definitely lends itself to a recreation, a treatment, somehow. I have not been contacted yet, but I would definitely be interested in talking to somebody about it. I think it would be very cool.
Wow, it would be a neat thing. I mean, it's one of those period pieces you got to have. People love that era too. We love things like from the
Yeah.
Gilded Age up to that time period. It's just a fascinating period of time, and with so much happening technologically, like you said, from the L's and the cabs, you had the streetcars, etc. It was a big time of change, and it was Chicago. A lot
Yeah.
goes on in
Yeah.
Chicago.
Yeah.
I'll tell you. Well, that's really something. Now,
So true.
we go back to John Hertz. Now, we're recording this the end of it's Halloween Day. And coming up this weekend is a huge thing called the Breeders' Cup for horse racers, the ultimate event out in Del Mar, California. And John Hertz has a connection to horse racing. Tell us a little bit about John Hertz.
Yeah, no, he was a fascinating guy. Before he made the shift into automobiles, he initially thought he was going to be a boxing manager of some lightweight and featherweight and middleweight boxers in Chicago. So he was very interested in the sporting life for all of his life. So when he starts having some success with Yellow Cab, one of the things he does is he decides to start breeding thoroughbred racehorses, and he buys a farm not too far from Chicago, about 40 miles northwest of Chicago in Cary, Illinois, and he calls it Leona Farms after his oldest daughter. And they start doing, sort of training and breeding of thoroughbred horses on that property. And they had quite a bit of success with this operation. And at the time, during the 20s, they had a Derby winner, actually, named Ray Count, who was very successful. And then Ray Count essentially, once the racing life is over for Ray Count becomes a sire for many other horses that they breed there. And one of Ray Count's offspring, Count Fleet, ends up becoming a Triple Crown winner during World War II. So it was a very successful operation that he had just kind of as a hobby.
Isn't that something? Yeah, we don't also didn't and this is where I get a little didn't John Hertz actually sell his a company to General Motors, then buy it back? Do you remember that story? What was that all about?
Yeah, so it was actually the Hertz rent-a-car. He comes up with the rental car concept at the same time that he's doing Yellow Cab. He says, "Well, some people might actually want to drive themselves. They might, have a situation where they're traveling and they might want to drive themselves. So, how could we figure out how to do that?" So he comes up with the concept for Hertz Rent-A-Car. Um, this was probably in 1923 or 4 that he comes up with the concept. In 1925, General Motors approaches him because they want to buy the manufacturing arm of Yellow Cab. They identify that it's a moneymaker, and they're like, you know what, we would like to buy up the Yellow Cab manufacturing. And they say, we'll put you on our board of directors, but we'd also like, I think he kind of to sweeten the deal, he kind of says, I'll also throw in this rental car concept, and you can own that as well. So they owned it, but I think he kind of was still very much involved in overseeing it. And then in the 1950s, they wanted to divest themselves from the rental car business, and so he decides to buy it back later in his life, and he takes control of Hertz Rent a Car back in the
See,
1950s.
that's a little fact no one knows. Who would think that Hertz would sell the rental car and get it back? I always thought he owned the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Hey,
yeah.
we talked about the manufacturing arms. And did Checker have their own manufacturing arm for their own cabs?
So they sort of did, and this was kind of where the Civil War comes in. A lot of Checker cabs were purchased from a company called the Checker Cab Manufacturing Company, which was based in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and it was run by a man named Morris Markin. And it was not officially connected to the Checker Taxi Company of Chicago. They were two separate businesses. But Morris Markin realized very early on that the Checker Taxi Company of Chicago is one of his biggest clients. And if he could have control of one of his biggest clients, then he could negotiate the best terms for his manufacturing business. So he is on the other side of the Checker Taxi Civil War. We've got, the union affiliated gangster guys who want control for monetary reasons. And then we've got Morris Markin, who wants control, I mean, for other monetary reasons, which is essentially that it will bring a lot of business into his manufacturing company, right? So those are your two main players in the Checker Taxi Civil War, and it is definitely related to the manufacturing.
And he's a Russian immigrant, if I'm not mistaken.
He was, yes. He was a Russian immigrant. It was interesting because he was a Russian immigrant and a Jewish Russian immigrant. And John Hertz at Yellow Cab was a Slovakian immigrant and also Jewish. So, it was funny that, there were these two sort of rivals who were kind of in control of the cab companies in Chicago. And they both had kind of similar stories to how they got there, which was
And both were
interesting.
successful. I mean, let's say, but while I do think
Hmm.
Checker Cab was evil empire, Morris Markin was successful in what he was doing, and it's a great success story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
one of the things this ends somehow. Okay, the taxi wars end. What?
Yes.
How did? How?
Yeah.
Why did it finally end?
Yeah, so I tell people, there was this sort of battle for power, and eventually one person gets control of 85% of the cab industry in Chicago. And when I ask people to guess who they think wins the 85% of the cab industry, most people guess John Hertz because he had been so visionary and so, really trying to do all these interesting things, and he was very invested. It actually the winner of this war is actually Morris Markin, and he does that essentially by first gaining control of Checker Taxi. He does eventually oust these gangsters, and gets their power weakens and weakens and weakens until he eventually has control of Checker Taxi. And at the same time, John Hertz, because of various violent things that are happening against Yellow Cab and against John Hertz's family personally, he just decides, you know what, it's not worth it. I don't want to be involved in this anymore. And he quietly arranges to sell all of his shares of Yellow Cab stock to Morris Markin also.
Oh, so Morris ends up owning both of them. Oh,
He does, and he operates them not well, I mean, they're the same parent company, but there were still Yellow Cabs and Checker Taxis on the street, so you might not know that they were owned by the same owner, but yeah, starting around 1929, 1930, He owns all of them essentially, and all through the 30s, is the most powerful cab owner in the country. He also takes over cab companies in New York and Pittsburgh and Cleveland and all over the country. So he definitely comes out the winner of the taxi wars eventually.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think didn't they start to make threats against the horses or the horse, farm that, Hertz had?
Yeah, yeah. So that was actually kind of the defining moment for John Hertz, I think. There was a devastating fire at his Leona Farms stud barn, actually, where he kept his valuable stud horses. And it was something like 11 horses that perished in the fire, including a future Derby contender that they had a lot of hope for winning the Derby the next year. And initially, John Hurt says, "Oh, I think it was an accident. I don't think it was arson." He initially doesn't want to cast aspersions on anybody, but the police and the other law enforcement agencies that are investigating this pretty quickly decide that they think it was arson. And then for several weeks thereafter, John Hertz's family starts getting death threats from an unknown, person. And so it does seem like it was definitely something related to the taxi wars. There were also bombings happening in garages at that same time. And that's kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back for John Hertz. He had spent the 10, 15 years building up this incredible business, and he finally just decides, you know what? I'm going to walk away from it. It's not worth it.
Smart man. Smart man. Hey, listen, what is next for Anne Morrissey? There's gotta be another great story out there you wanna tell us.
This story was a labor of love and a real passion project. I had the family connection. I had the connections to some other people in the story. I haven't found the story yet that is the next thing that's going to grab my attention like that and inspire me to devote the number of hours that it would take. But you know what? I hope that you're right. I hope that it's out there, and when it is, I will turn to that.
Good. Well, very good. Well, I gotta tell you what, friends, I had a wonderful time talking. I hope you learned as much as I did. I told you she does much better than I did, to be very honest with you. And because she knows all these details, and it's just fantastic. So I would just want to say, Anne Marcy, thank you so very much for coming on today on Books and Looks. It's been a joy talking with you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Blaine. I had a great time.
Well, friends, that was some exciting interview. I learned so much. As I said, this was a wild time. Chicago was wild and woolly in those days, but I never knew it extended to taxi wars. Always something you learn in these books. I'll tell you, great job, Anne. Hey, by the way, what am I looking at? Well, I'm looking at a book that was going to get my page turner of the year. Yeah, the page turner of the year is coming up next week. It is called Eden Undone by author named Abbott Kaler. It is a spectacular, spectacular nonfiction book that takes place on the Galapagos Islands. Oh, yeah. Sex, murder, love, intrigue, all on the Galapagos Islands. Not with turtles, my friends, but with people. Oh, my. Is this a page turner? Wow. I can't wait to talk to her. Don't want to miss that one, okay? So, anyway, hey, listen, on behalf of my soon to be up, I'm sure it's coming up any moment now, booksandlookspodcast.com. In behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book. So long.